I need some traction.
Hi, everyone. Lloyd Lobo here, co-founder at Traction and Boast AI. Today's Traction webinar is brought to you by Boast AI and Launch Academy in partnership with Growth Blazers. Super excited for today's topic. We have Vimeo's president and chief product officer, Mark Kornfilt, with us. Mark was previously the CEO and co-founder at Livestream, the leading live video platform that powered over 10 million streams a year, which Vimeo acquired. And today, Mark's going to share with us all the tips and techniques for building high growth products. Welcome to Traction, Mark. You've had a super successful career as an engineer and as a founder. You sold your company to Vimeo. Give us your backstory. How did you get to where you are today?
Sure. So I started my career as a software engineer. I was actually one of the developers of this app called LimeWire. I don't know if you recall. This was years ago. So a peer-to-peer.
I used LimeWire.
I did too. So peer-to-peer was my specialty, and then in the end of 2006, one of my friends asked me if I wanted to join him and three other co-founders to start Livestream. So we incorporated in January 2007. I was initially actually one of the technical co-founders. So I led engineering for a couple of years. And then at the end of 2011, I decided that I was fed up with leading engineering, that I wanted to talk to customers. And so I went back to Europe, and I was supposed to start our first sales office outside of the US. So I toured Europe for 6 months, trying to sell the product and pitching the product, which was quite a change for me, and actually a pretty transformative experience. And starting to find out what it takes to actually make a company successful outside of building the product. And then I started an executive MBA. That summer, I started a new business for the company. I went instead of opening up a sales office, I went straight back into building products, built a new product for live streaming for betting companies, out of all things. And that was actually completely different stack, completely different IP, completely different customer base. And I ended up selling that business after 3 years, came back to New York to get back into the headquarters and go through a pretty big transformation that we were going through with Livestream. We had hired a new CEO, external CEO. That was in 2015. And in 2017, the board asked me to step in as the CEO of the company. I ran the company for a bit and sold it at the end of the year the end of 2017 to Vimeo. And I've been at Vimeo since then. So it's been a little bit more than 4 years, held a bunch of roles at Vimeo. I was initially there for the let's make this acquisition successful period, and then ended up really liking the environment and taking on broader responsibilities with time. And today I'm Chief Product Officer. I run product engineering, corp dev, M&A, and do a bunch of things at the company.
All the important stuff that makes a company grow explosively. Fantastic. So what led you to Vimeo, though? I mean, you could have sold the company to any number of people. Firstly, why decide to sell Livestream, and why Vimeo?
Why sell and why Vimeo? So pretty different questions. Why Vimeo? Because they were very aligned with our strategy, actually. We were doing in live streaming what Vimeo had started to do in the broader world of video, and particularly for VOD, pre-recorded content. And what that was really democratizing video for businesses, making it possible for any business in the world to be effective with video, to be more productive, to reach more bigger audiences with video. And we were doing exactly that for live streaming. So it was quite a natural fit. Why also is because they reached out in 2017 to see if we were interested to join forces. and the timing was right for us. Combination of things. We saw a lot of overlap with what Vimeo was doing. It was quite a logical fit for our users. It was quite a logical fit for our team, and ultimately the timing was right for investors. I mean, that's probably one of the important factors as well.
Now, as founders are thinking about, should we continue building or should we sell? Is there any frameworks or thought processes that you advise people should go through to think about that? Like, is it the right time to sell? Should I keep going?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I'll say that first of all. When you're confronted with that opportunity, in our case, it was not something we were actually actively looking to do. We got outreach from Vimeo and had to think about it long and hard at that time. I don't know if there's a framework that works broadly. I would say for me, like I said, the primary considerations were, is it good for the users? And by that, I mean what we are trying to achieve, our mission, what we're trying to achieve in terms of the value that we add to our users. Is it going to get us further, faster? Yeah. So the first question is it good for your users? Does it further your mission? Do you go faster? The second question is it good for your team? And, is there a logical fit for them? And third, is it good for your investors and for your shareholders? Is it the right value that you want for your shareholders? That includes, by the way, the employees in your company. That's the way I sort of thought about it at the time.
Well, that's a fantastic way to look at it, right? Is it good for your team? Is it good for the users? Starting with the users, right? It's always about the customers. You can't build a business without customers. You can't build a business without people and the team. And then the third, is it good for the investors? Fantastic. So, you've been through a few journeys now: LimeWire, Livestream, now Vimeo. What were some hard-earned learnings that shaped your life and career that has made you successful, you would say?
There's so much in there, Lloyd. It's difficult to boil it down. I'll tell you a couple that come to mind. I think the first one is the importance of your go-to-market machine. If you have my background, you index highly on building and the product aspect of things. And naively, I started Livestream, I was 23. So naively, you kind of think, build it and they'll come. Obviously, that's not the way it works. And so early on, developing the right muscles on the go-to-market side is really fundamental for a tech company. And I know many tech companies are founded by folks with engineering and product backgrounds, and it's not necessarily second nature to them to think about that early. But I would think about that early. The second big learning I think I can tell you is communicate a lot. Again, it's not second nature for somebody like me, but the importance of over communicating with your team, and by the way, communicating externally as well. And you have to pick your battles. I don't think you can spend your time early on going around and networking and speaking at conferences. You have to spend most of your time building the company. But there is a lot of value to being out there and getting feedback from peers, from the market, from other investors. That's something that I probably didn't index highly enough on at the beginning. I think in terms of building a company, probably choosing the right investors. I think your investors can make a huge difference to your growth, and picking investors that are experienced, that have seen other companies that have gone through what you're going through, that have comparables, benchmarks that will give you a sense of where you stand, can be really helpful. It's, everybody says that, but it's pretty lonely starting a company. At points, you really have very little data points on whether you're doing the right thing. And I think a great investor will do that. They'll be close enough to the business that they will have the right information to be able to point you to the right benchmarks. You can still get that from others, from advisors, but finding people that have enough incentives to stay close to you and really guide you along the way is hard. So your investors can really play that role. Yeah, I think those are probably some of the most important lessons that I've learned.
Awesome. And now coming back to Vimeo, what is the most innovative thing you're working on at Vimeo right now? And how do you think that will help people and impact the world?
I'd call out two. I can't share too much, being a public company, but I'll call out two things that I'm quite passionate about. The first one is probably obvious to the people that are watching this webinar, but I do believe that live experiences online are still way too dull, and they're not social and interactive enough. And one of the things we're doing is really rethinking live experiences altogether, rethinking the way that live events are experienced online, and coming up with an entirely new way that you'll see us come to market with in the next couple of months. The other one is what I'll put in the bucket of sharing knowledge more effectively with video. The video as a communication medium has evolved a ton in the last couple of years, and it's now used across the board, from HR to marketing departments to sales departments. And the reality is, very often you end up being in front of a video that is 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, with all this information locked into the video. And it's just difficult to get to the knowledge that you really want to get to. And so we're really rethinking the way video is created, the way that knowledge is managed within videos, and then the way it's surfaced to users on the other end. And I think that will dramatically change the utility of video particularly within businesses, within organizations that want to use it to be more productive.
I'm a big user of video, and we have over 300 plus sessions. So I'm excited to see what Vimeo comes out with and how we can leverage that as well. So shifting gears to product and building products for high growth, Vimeo is a product-led company. The most valuable companies of the past decade, from Dropbox to Shopify to Airbnb, have been product-led companies. How do you define product-led, and what are some key traits for success in building a product-led company?
I think there's really two aspects of product-led. The first one is strategy. How do you guide the strategy of the company? And I think product-led companies that do this well start with users, user problems, and how do you build products to solve these user needs? And everything else in the strategy sort of derives from that. Obviously, you cannot do that in a vacuum, right? You have to think about how you solve these needs and how do you go to market with those products together. but it starts with what are you building and how are you adding value through these products. The other side, I think, of product-led companies is probably culture, where you really put the user at the center of everything you do, and it really becomes part of your values. You know, people talk about that a lot. Few companies do this really well. I'm sure you have your own brand names that you can think of that do that well, but establishing really a culture where you're putting the user at the center is quite essential, because then what happens is that you can develop the right empathy within the organization to really make the right decision across the board, the right decisions that will then drive value for your users. I think the other side of the culture is celebrating and putting first that craft of building. And it might seem a little bit a little bit discriminatory to some extent to make that decision, but I do think to build a good culture, you have to make choices. And I think in product-led organizations, there is this realization that the craft of building is really driving a lot of the value behind the company's growth. So really these two aspects, strategy and the culture aspect.
Definitely. Let's double click on a few of this. So when it comes to strategy, what are some key elements of strategy that founders and company builders should think about? What are the key components of building a solid strategy?
It starts with finding an opportunity in the market. What is the market that you're going after? Have you identified a problem that you can solve uniquely well, and that you will have a sustainable advantage in serving? And is the market big enough that you're trying to go after? And then do you have the capabilities to execute on this opportunity? So really the who, the what, the how, and that's where it starts from. As you build up the company and as you build up your product portfolio, it's really finding the next areas that you're going to apply your focus to, being able to be really intentional and choiceful about when do you take on additional areas of focus, and again, really focusing on the business impact that you can make with each of these areas that you decide to solve. I think that has to be, sometimes it's sort of an afterthought for many first-time founders, but I think you got to start with making assumptions about what is the business impact that I can drive in 6 months, in 1 year, in 3 years. It's a difficult exercise, and you've got to make a lot of assumptions to do that, but it's at the core of the strategy. It forces you to really put metrics and KPIs down that then will drive really the clarity that you need to be able to execute on your strategy well.
Fantastic. Now, coming to the product development framework or product management framework at Vimeo, what does that look like? How do you guys figure out what to build, what to prioritize? How should founders learn from that?
We have different aspects. I mean, so I always hesitate to talk about product process in a vacuum. I think it's really, really important both to have it as a guiding light for your product teams. It's also really important to not be too dogmatic about product process. That being said, I mean, we have the typical phases of planning, of opportunity assessment, discovery, designing, finding solutions for your opportunity, getting into build, getting into launch, post-launch assessing the success of your launch and iterating from there. And obviously, the tighter that loop, the better it is. But that's sort of the general framework that we use to go and build. The way that we're structured is also actually, a key part of doing this well, which is much like many other companies, structure the product teams in 5 to 8 people teams that are a combination of product leadership, design leadership, engineering leadership, and then an engineering team. And then obviously plugging in some of the other important stakeholders like BI, product marketing on top of that. That balance of engineering, product management, and design, I think, is one of the key pieces to get right. I can't underscore how each of these pieces plays a fundamental piece in building the right products. I think good products, the art of building good products, is really coming in at the intersection of these three and matching that with a business opportunity that you identify. The moment you have an imbalance there, it can really lead you down the wrong path. For example, completely failing on your planning, not being able to foresee what you can build or what you can't build. The engineering voice really helps you with that, or not putting enough emphasis on the user experience. What's the ideal experience you'd want your users to go through? That can happen if your design voice isn't strong enough, or not tying this back to company strategy or the business metrics that you're trying to impact, which can happen if your product management function is not strong enough. And I've experienced all of that.
And it's hard to recruit for that, right? Let's say you had to start your team from scratch, a product team, or maybe a company team, because when you're just coming up with an idea and starting a company, really that product team is the whole company, or the first few people. Who would be the first people you would bring on? How would you build your team if you were planning to start a company and build it for hyper growth today?
I would definitely start with a small team of doers, people that have the same sense of urgency as you. And yeah, I would start small. I mean, I think at the beginning when you start, it's about validating your idea or validating the opportunity as quickly as you can. So it starts with a couple of engineers and, a product and a designer, and just iterating really quickly on that. The next phases we can talk about, I think, look a little bit different on depending on how your initial phase looks like. But I definitely favor starting small. I think in order to get the right learnings, that's really important to keep it tight at the beginning.
And a lot of people, don't value speed enough. Maybe you can talk to us about the importance of speed, right? Because sometimes what happens is you either you do the initial, let's get to the MVP, let's validate, let's get a bunch of customers. Now you add more customers, you're moving really fast. But then as you raise money and you add more people, you start losing some of that speed. And maybe as founders, if you abstract yourself maybe several degrees from doing things, then you lose that speed all the more. Any sort of hacks or best practices you've implemented to make sure the speed is intact and companies are moving? Because sometimes what happens is you may hire like big company folks and you spend more time in the planning phase versus executing and shipping, right?
I'll tell you, it's one of my big anxieties is nowadays is moving slowly. I definitely think that's a risk that you have when you grow. Today we're north of 1,000 people at Vimeo, and I worry about this every day. How do we continue to keep innovating, to keep building, to keep creating value at the right pace? Because yes, for sure, as you grow, there are more stakeholders. Decisions tend to take more time. There is more ripple effects for every decision that you make that touch more people throughout the organization. So again, the emphasis on communication, you need to communicate more by nature. So I would say that there's the two immediate hacks, they're not hacks, actually, the two immediate solves that come to mind are: one, structure your teams in a way that you can give them as much autonomy and accountability as possible. And so, in other words, minimize the interfaces that are needed, the coordination that is needed between multiple teams. Definitely in the context of product teams, it goes through having real clarity around the lines that are drawn around each of the product team, whether that's around surface in your products, whether that's around KPIs that they're targeting, whether that's around use cases or personas that they serve. But the least amount of overlap, the more the teams will be empowered to go quickly, make decisions, and move. The second one, which is not an obvious one, probably one I had not realized until I sold my company, is build a culture of trust. Because in a larger organization, your ability to make decisions quickly and effectively depends a lot on your ability to communicate transparently and honestly. And I think your ability to communicate transparently and honestly depends a lot on the trust that people have for each other. I remember, at points sitting in meetings where somebody would present something and another person would jump in and say, great idea, this is really interesting, you've made a really good point, you might want to consider XYZ. And it's great for psychological safety to take these roundabout ways of voicing your opinion. The problem, though, is that if you're not straightforward or if you're not direct enough, many times you leave these meetings with the completely wrong understanding between people and the wrong understanding as to what the next steps should be. So trust is a real accelerator in a business. Trust is a real accelerator when you can just tell each other what it is, the way it is. I think it really helps you move faster. And it's not a problem that you'll see in young startups, because your survival in a startup is just so much based on your ability to be, honest with each other and move quickly. But at scale, you see that creeping in. You see that those, indirect opinions and sort of more passive aggressive ways of communicating creeping in, and that kills your pace. It kills your productivity.
How do you nip that in the bud, though? Like, what are some ways to build trust and make sure people are communicating as directly, obviously, without being jerks, right?
Yeah, look, it's a couple of things. First, just to be clear, I think people should be kind to each other, and you have to make sure that you have that as a core principle in your organization. You cannot be jerks and come in all guns blazing and be aggressive with each other. So kindness is key. I would tell you that probably second to that is establishing norms where you make it an expectation that feedback has to be provided, and that it has to be clear, and that it has to be transparent. And you make that part of the way that you do evaluations. You make that part of the way that you do 360 feedback. You make that part of the way that you encourage people to talk to each other in every occasion you can. So yeah, making that part of your norms. And then I think I think lastly, just making sure you put yourself out there, you as a leader and all of your leaders too. People feel much better about transparent, candid feedback when you are you make yourself vulnerable, you show yourself vulnerable as well, and you make sure that people understand that your intent is a positive one. I think that's probably a really helpful way for people to then digest your feedback.
A while ago, I read a book called Five Dysfunctions of a Team, and they talk
Yeah,
about bringing yourself, being vulnerable, and that is the first step to building trust. Because if the leaders are not vulnerable, then others don't want to come forward as well, and then
that's
things
right.
start to trickle downhill from there. And earlier on, you said something about
Sorry,
communication.
just to add to that, the last piece probably that I didn't mention is just invest time in building relationships. There's no miracle. Trust comes from spending time with each other and building relationships, and building the personal aspect as well.
Yeah, definitely. And empathy and communication is a big part of that. You talked about empathy, you talked about communication as well. A lot of people sort of communicate gung-ho when things are going well, but they stop communicating when things are going bad. And probably transparent communication is needed all the more when things are going bad, because when things are going bad and you start ghosting or start disappearing or not communicating, then then people get worried, right? And that
Yep.
sort of erodes trust in a big way. I'm going to take some audience questions here as well before I pull in some of mine. A question here is, what are some things that you did to be successful after the acquisition? Because this ties in, you're integrating two teams now. We talked about empathy, we talked about trust, we talked about relationships, we talked about communication. But personally, and from your team perspective, what are some things you did to become successful and ensure that the acquisition was successful with Vimeo?
Yeah, I would say what are some of the, I'll answer what are some of the things we did as a team. It's really, really important. It's a partnership, right? You can't do it alone as a founder or as the CEO. It has to be an effort that's broader and really sponsored by the leadership of the acquiring company. The first thing that I did is try to make sure that people are comfortable with having a new identity and that it's a good one for them. And it goes through things like the day after the acquisition, I went back to our office and to the Livestream office, and I took every Livestream sign down and I replaced them with Vimeo signs. And, every time I could, I just put the Vimeo identity and Vimeo brand up in our internal meetings. That it can look or sound a little bit superficial, but it starts with small things like that. People feeling like the founders have really embraced that new identity, and then themselves feeling comfortable with the acquiring company. And then from then on, it's spending a lot of time being thoughtful about what people do in the new structure. How can they be impactful? And in the end, I'll tell you, the success of an acquisition is all about the people. It really is all about the people. That takes a lot of prep and it takes a lot of intentionality. The worst that can happen, and I've seen this play out, is people feeling like they don't really have a role, or they don't really have a way to make an impact anymore. And that's the beginning. It's the beginning of the end. And then the third one is just, of course, keep an obsessive focus on the business that you've sold and making sure that it's successful. And a lot of these acquisitions are based on thesis that you, as the acquired, have to either bring to life or heavily sponsor. And I think being committed to that, making it work no matter what, is is the approach that you should take. Of course, that doesn't always pan out, but I think that's an important one as well.
Certainly. Now, there's a few questions here on prioritization. How are you able to quickly compare and prioritize features based on return potential? And then how do you approach pricing these features? Another question was around basically, how do you prioritize building out the core product versus adding new products? So perhaps you can share some frameworks around how do you guys prioritize new things, new features, and how do you decide when to add new products?
Yeah, I'll start with our general philosophy on building roadmaps, because I think it touches on that. Generally, I think a healthy roadmap should be a combination of three things. One, big bets or bet that you're making to open up a market that you don't necessarily have today. This is going after a new addressable market, and that becomes more and more, it's of course implied when you start a company. This is all a big bet, but as you get product market fit and you think about what are the next avenues of growth, it can be comfortable to just think about iterating on your existing products. So you have to push yourself to always think, okay, what is the one new thing that will ensure that I'm not on a linear growth path, and I can have a step function increase. They don't, like all product initiatives, if you're doing it right, they shouldn't all work. Some will work, some won't, but maintaining always at least one of these big bets is key. The second area is improving your existing products and improving your competitive differentiation in the existing markets that you are already present in, market or markets, and improving your ability to acquire new users through that. And that is much more of the iterating on product market fit, iterating on your existing growth, improving your conversion rates, driving more users into your funnel and into your products by improving your offering. And then the third piece that should always be in your roadmaps is, how do you improve your experience for your existing users? How do you keep your existing users happy, or how do you make them happier, increase your NPS scores, increase your retention numbers? And those ultimately, particularly in the world of SaaS, as you grow your business, that becomes a bigger and bigger lever and needs to be part of any good roadmap. So we think about the roadmap in terms of these three different types of product initiatives. And then prioritizing within that really goes through opportunity assessment. And it's a little bit of what we've talked about before. How big is the market that you're trying to go after? Try to size the business impact that you can have with the initiative. Against that, size your effort, your investment that is needed, and then size your ability to compete over time, or gauge your ability to compete over time. And the balance of these components will give you that framework of how to prioritize. And needless to say that also the more you grow, the more you think about the component pieces of your strategy, so specific product areas and how that rolls up to your broader product strategy. It's really also about the alignment to the overall strategy. And that becomes a key component, right? Is this opportunity that I'm thinking about, is it aligned with the key KPIs of the business? Is it aligned with the key use cases that we're trying to solve? Is it aligned with existing go-to-market motions that I have that can make this successful quickly?
That's a fantastic way to think about it. Great framework for all of us. Now, what KPIs are top of mind for you, and how do you define success for yourself and Vimeo? What KPIs do you measure?
There's several layers here. I guess the first layer is the financial KPIs of the business, and that depends on what type of business you're in, whether it's marketplace, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's SaaS. In our case, the key KPIs are obviously new subscribers, subscriber retention, subscriber expansion or migration, and then, within that, subsets of that. The second layer is product KPIs, and you use your product KPIs as proxies for the financial KPIs, because very often the metrics, the financial metrics that you're trying to move will take time. I'll give you an example. If you want to move cohort retention in SaaS, particularly in a business like Vimeo, which is a lot of annual subscriptions, well, you can get some early signals, but the reality is the financial measure will only happen a year after people are introduced to your product, and you can start moving their retention. So there's a big lag time there. And so you use proxy KPIs, product KPIs, like product retention. Somebody's using your product, what percentage of your users come back after week 1, after week 4, after week 10? Monthly active users, right, which is another way of looking at engagement. Activation rates across the funnel. Just pure K-factor type of KPIs. So, for virality KPIs. So for each user that comes in, how many users do they bring in? User satisfaction, NPS. And so on and so forth. So you have, NPS is a great way for you to know whether your retention is going to go to shit or whether it's going to be good, because a happy user generally stays with you if you have the right willingness to pay. But so that's the second layer is the product KPIs, and how you measure success is very dependent on individual situations, what you're trying to solve for.
Definitely. Now, I like the focus on leading indicators because, yes, you're right. In SaaS companies, and especially a lot of SaaS companies where there's annual contracts, you don't know if the customer is going to churn till the end of the year. But if you see the engagement and watch the engagement and see, are people coming back week over week or month over month or whatever your core requirement of your product engagement is, then that's a good way to see if they're going to churn or they're going to stick around. Like getting them, is there a North Star metric? Like we need a user to do XYZ, maybe like it's upload X number of videos, or if you're like a Slack, send X number of messages per day kind of thing. So those leading indicators, I like that focus on leading indicators. And a lot of companies don't look at leading indicators. They see, oh, is the user churning or not? And they look at maybe a monthly or they look at an annual, but I think the leading indicator tells the whole story. Now, you talked a little bit about GTM and go-to-market and growth engines and the importance of that. And there's a question here around elaborating on the GTM strategy of live stream or video, and in your opinion on how to define that at an early stage company. What are the key elements?
Repeat that question, Lloyd.
Yeah, definitely. There's a question here around building a growth engine or a go-to-market strategy at an early stage company. How should people think about it?
Well, it very much depends on the business model that you have. Building an enterprise go-to-market engine or sales-assisted go-to-market engine is quite different from a self-serve one. That's quite different from building a marketplace business model. So it really depends. I guess the generic piece of advice that I'll provide is, at the beginning, you should index very highly. You should obsess on user satisfaction, because at the beginning, the reality is, a lot of your validation is going to come from word of mouth, right? This is how you're going to attract your users. you have to figure out what is your next big lever after that. In some instances, it's going to be viral loops, and those are great business models. If you have a business that has natural viral loops, in some instances, not at all. In some instances, you're going to start developing a sales force pretty quickly, and I guess, figuring out what that is early on, I guess at inception point, before you even start building your first product, is very, very key. And because then you have to surround yourself with the people that can help you achieve that strategy.
Definitely. Now, there's a lot of talk around virality, right? Have you picked up any best practices or hacks, or I hate using the word hacks for lack of a better word, but have you picked up some strategies to engineer virality into products you've built, like Livestream and Vimeo, or other things you've done?
Well, you have to kind of think about where virality comes from. There's probably three different types of viral loops that I can think of. The first one is where your product is really a powerful marketing channel. Let me just articulate that a little bit better. Give you an example. Vimeo is a video platform that allows people to broadcast video content to a very high number of viewers, right? Actually, the natural behavior is you'll upload a video, you'll send that to a bunch of people, and then they'll consume that video in the Vimeo player. Our free version, in our free subscription, you have the Vimeo logo on the bottom right of the player, which means every impression of our player is, in some sense, an advert for the business. And that's millions and millions and millions of impressions every month. And that's quite unique, but there are a bunch of businesses where really the product itself is a broadcast product and can serve as your marketing channel. The second category is probably the category where your users are extracting more value by using the product with their friends or their colleagues, by having multiple people, by having a group of people use the product. And obviously a fundamental example of that is Slack or communication tools like that, where you can't really use it by yourself, but that creates obviously a viral loop. You invite a colleague, the product becomes better by inviting the colleague. They invite a colleague, and then you grow your user base like that. And the third, probably one that you were maybe referring to, is sort of growth hacks that you can do, like referring a friend, where you're incentivizing your users to bring in other users against some sort of incentive, maybe free usage on your platform, free subscription or discount or something like that. It's quite dependent on what your product does, is what I would say. I think the best models are the first and the second one that I've mentioned. They're the most powerful. And you really start to see a flywheel build up pretty quickly, particularly in the second example of sort of multiplayer products, where people are getting more value by being with their colleagues or with their friends in the product.
Definitely. And I love that. And a lot of what you said stems from user happiness. If customers are happy, they're using your product, they're getting the value, and they keep coming back every time they have the problem to solve it, then sharing it becomes actually easy. You just need to surface that when they experience those moments of wow. I want to get into the last segment of the session today. because we're getting close to the top of the hour. What are 5 things you wish someone told you before you started your journey, and why?
The first one is probably it's going to take more time than you expect. I started naively. I was 23. I started naively thinking that, there'd be some sort of outcome 6 months or a year after I started. And I'm still in the video space 14 years after I started Livestream. Though with a lot of changes, obviously, in the process, but Livestream itself was a 10-year story. And so I guess from a personal perspective, I might have done things a little bit differently, or I might have thought about pacing myself a little bit differently. I think that's key. If you're starting a company, just be prepared that that's a journey. It's, be prepared for the next 10 years of your life. Some of the others we've talked about, I think, pick your investors right. Obviously, pick your co-founders and your partners right. And I think there on the partnerships that you form, remain truthful to yourself and impeccable on your work ethics, and that pays off a lot of dividends later on. The third one is probably around communication and spending enough time outside of your own head and outside of your own company and outside of the day-to-day of building. And it's really easy for somebody like me, at least, with a background in building really the product, to index highly towards that. In my mind, when I started, every activity that wasn't just building or selling the product was not useful and not to be prioritized for many years when I started Livestream. And that, I think, is a mistake. I think there's a lot of value that you get outside of your company early on. Again, you can't over-index on it. I've seen founders make the mistake of thinking, building your persona, your public persona is the key to giving visibility to your business, and just wasting a ton of time on that. But you have to have a healthy amount of that, and you have to make sure that you spend some of your time getting a sense of what others are doing. I think that's pretty key. And then, that also applies internally. I think people want to hear from you as a founder. People want to hear from you as a leader. They want to hear from you often. They want the clarity of knowing that what they're working on are the right things. They want to know the context that you have that they might not have. Most people in their day-to-day job are seeing some narrow view of the business that they're focused on, and you have a responsibility to bring the broader context to them, to help them make better decisions. So communication would be probably the next one. And I guess the last one is take a lot of time to hire. Never, ever compromise on hiring. Every time I've made a compromise on hiring, it backfired. It's always the wrong decision. Make sure you take a long time, or you take the right amount of time to find people. That's particularly true as you find your partners in business and your exec teams. And this is an area where you're definitely not wasting time forming conviction around people.
I've learned now, if it's not a hell yes, then it's it's a no. But hiring is one of the hardest things. What are one or two things you've learnings you've developed to make sure that you don't go wrong on hires? Because mishires can cost your company in months or years if it's at the executive level, right?
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, the first one, obvious, you have to know yourself very well to understand how to surround yourself. This is particularly true when you start a company and in early days of founding a business. You have to surround yourself with people that are complementary to what you do. And that's not obvious for first-time founders, particularly. Just understanding what that looks like can be tricky. Sorry, let me just drink water. I'd say number two, be clear on what you're looking for. Be clear on the job description. Always spend the right amount of time just drafting the key criteria, the key responsibilities, and always go back to that. Number three, be consistent in the way that you interview people. Try to organize yourself with an interview framework that you will use. It's really easy to get biased and lose your reference points if you're not structured in the way that you interview people. And number four, I think, experience. There's just, you form an intuition over time. Interviewing is, it's a matter of optimizing for or against false positives at the expense of false negatives. But the only way that you do that well is by trying, hiring, making mistakes, and then being honest with yourself as to why you made the mistake and trying to avoid it in the future.
Definitely. Now, do you have a favorite interview question that you ask?
I try to get to something that gets the person really, really passionate about whatever it is that, whatever area you're interviewing them in. One of the ways that I get there is by asking them what gets them really excited when they wake up in the morning and what drags them down, what brings them energy versus what takes energy away. And I think it's always telling as a question, and it helps you go down the path of finding what people are really passionate about.
Fantastic. Awesome. We're at the top of the hour here. Any unconventional advice that people ignore but shouldn't, in your opinion?
Yeah. Product management is a very odd function. It's one that very few people get trained on, at least in college. And a great product manager or a great product person, actually, more broadly, can take a million different shapes and forms. And I don't over-index on people that have the process perfected down to the last detail, because that's important. But ultimately, what matters the most is that you're actually building the right things. You can have your process perfect. You can have an amazing product engine that ships things. But if you're shipping the wrong things and it doesn't matter to users, it doesn't matter to the business. And so index on people that have built great things, or that you can see have that ability to build great things.
Fantastic. And my final question, any books or resources that have shaped your career and your journey or been immensely helpful to you?
Well, on
You know
some of the
what's
topics
interesting?
we touched on
You know,
together. Yeah. Yeah.
you know what's interesting is I don't read. I interview two smart people like yourself every week.
Well, that's a good shortcut. Um, I loved the hard thing about hard things. That was a very important book for me when I read it. It speaks a lot about product too, and um, I think it's not a very recent book, but it's still very, very relevant. Um, Radical candor. We've talked about creating this culture of candor and transparency and being direct, culture of feedback. Um, Maybe I'll leave you with these two.
That is fantastic. I think Radical Candor is a great book, and Hard Things About Hard Things is also a fantastic book. Are you active on social? Where do we follow you?
Oh, I'm not at all. LinkedIn, probably.
Yeah, me too. I'm like, if you're building a company, it's hard to have time to be active on multiple things, but maybe in the next alternate career. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark. Some great, fantastic advice here. Folks, the recording will be on our YouTube by the end of this week, and then on Spotify and on Apple in the coming weeks. I dropped the links below. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy Morocco, Mark. It's a fun
I
city. I heard.
appreciate the time. Appreciate the time. Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you. Love and peace.
I need some traction.